year was 1873. The air in Pine Ridge, Oregon, was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of wealth. For the loggers of that era, the Pacific Northwest wasn't just a landscape. It was a sprawling, untamed beast, waiting to be conquered. The timber was a gold rush in green, and every man with an axe and a will to work saw a chance to leave his mark and secure his future. Elias Thorne, a man with calloused hands and a burning ambition in his eyes, was no different. He had assembled a crew of 15 men, each a veteran of the unforgiving wilderness, each with their own reasons for seeking fortune in the deep woods. They were a mix of seasoned veterans and young, eager laborers, all drawn by the siren call of a legendary stand of old-growth timber, rumored to be the largest in the region. The operation was Thorne & Sons Logging, though the Sons part was more of a hopeful aspiration than a reality. Elias's son, Samuel, was just 19, his face clean-shaven and his spirit unbroken by the hardships of life. He was the youngest of the crew, a stark contrast to the grizzled veterans like Jedediah "Jed" Miller, a man with a beard like a tangled mat and a face weathered by 100 storms. Jed had seen it all, and he carried the weight of a lifetime of experience on his stooped shoulders. He was the crew's conscience, often cautioning Elias against risks, his wisdom a quiet counterpoint to Thorne's relentless drive. Their destination was a remote, untouched valley deep within the Cascade Mountains, a place locals called the Whispering Hollow, due to the way the wind seemed to carry hushed, eerie sounds through the dense forest. It was a 3-day journey by wagon, the trail slowly dissolving into a barely there path as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. The first 2 days were filled with a sense of camaraderie. Jokes were shared, songs were sung, and the air was alive with the easy banter of men united by a common purpose. They talked of the money they'd make, the families they'd support, and the legacy they'd build. On the 3rd day, the mood shifted. The sun, which had been a constant companion, was swallowed by thick gray clouds that hung low over the mountains. The wind picked up, no longer a gentle whisper, but a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from every direction at once. The trees grew closer, their canopies so dense they created a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. Jed, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "This ain't right, Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The air, it's different, heavy. The animals are gone. Didn't see a single squirrel or bird all morning." Elias dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. "Superstition, Jed. We're in the heart of untouched wilderness. The animals are just more skittish." But even he felt the change in the atmosphere. The easy chatter of the men died down, replaced by a tense silence. The forest seemed to be watching them, its ancient trees like silent sentinels. When they finally reached the valley, they set up a makeshift camp. The trees they had come for stood before them, titans of the forest, their trunks wider than a man could hug. The sight was breathtaking, but it did little to quell the growing unease. That night, under a sky completely shrouded in clouds, the camp was eerily still. The fire crackled, but its warmth did little to chase away the creeping cold. Elias was awake, huddled with Samuel by the fire, sharpening an axe. He noticed that several of the men were also awake, their eyes darting into the darkness beyond the firelight. Then they heard it, a sound that was not the wind, nor an animal. It was a rhythmic, faint thud, as if something was being struck repeatedly, a steady, low beat that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. "What in God's name is that?" Samuel whispered, his hand on his hunting knife. Jed, who was sitting across the fire, didn't answer right away. He just stared into the darkness, his face a mask of grim determination. "It's nothing," Elias said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Probably just a fallen log settling." But the thudding continued, a relentless, maddening rhythm that seemed to be counting down to something. Elias watched as one of the younger loggers, a boy named Finn, stood up, trembling. "I can't," he stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm leaving." Elias grabbed him by the arm. "Finn, sit down. We've come too far. It's just nerves." But the boy pulled away, his terror palpable. "No, I've heard stories about this place. They say the trees here have a memory, and they don't like trespassers." His voice cracked. "They say they get their pound of flesh." The thudding stopped as abruptly as it began, plunging the camp into a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise. Elias tried to calm the men, telling them it was all just a product of their overactive imaginations. But the trust was gone. The easy camaraderie had been replaced by a quiet suspicion. Elias looked around at the faces of his crew. 15 men had entered the forest with him. Now he wondered how many would leave. Later that night, as the men slept fitfully, a thick fog rolled in, so dense it seemed to swallow the light of the moon and stars. Elias woke with a jolt, a strange guttural noise cutting through the silence. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, but their voice was being strangled. He sat up, grabbing his rifle. The sound was coming from Jed's tent. Elias crept over, his heart pounding against his ribs. He unzipped the flap and peered inside. Jed was thrashing on his cot, his face contorted in a silent scream, his eyes wide open and staring at something only he could see. A thin, dark liquid was leaking from the corner of his mouth. Elias shook him, but Jed didn't respond, his body rigid with some unseen horror. When morning finally came, the men were a shattered reflection of their former selves. The grim silence of the night had followed them into the light. Jed was still unresponsive, his breathing shallow and ragged. Elias, shaken to his core, looked at his crew and saw a familiar fear in their eyes. They had all heard something in the night, something that had crept into their minds and taken root. The promise of Pine Ridge had soured. Now it was just a matter of survival. The 15 men had entered the forest, but Elias was starting to believe what Finn had said. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that not all of them would be walking out. If you've enjoyed the first chapter and want to see how this chilling mystery unfolds, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more. The morning mist in the whispering hollow clung to the trees like a shroud, and with it came a chilling stillness. The rhythmic thudding from the night before was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to press down on the camp. The men were quiet, their faces drawn and pale. The easy camaraderie of the journey had vanished, replaced by a grim, unspoken tension. They looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who among them would be next. Jedediah Miller lay on his cot, his breathing shallow and rattling, his eyes open but unseeing, a faint dark stain around his lips. It was a sight that terrified Elias Thorne more than any beast of the forest. Elias called a huddle, his voice low and firm, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. "Jed's got a fever," he said, the lie a bitter taste in his mouth. "He'll be fine. We just need to keep working. The sooner we're done, the sooner we're out of here." The men nodded, but their eyes told a different story. They were trapped, and they knew it. To abandon Jed would be a death sentence, and to stay was to risk the same fate. Samuel, his youthful idealism now clouded by fear, watched his father. He saw the doubt in Elias's eyes, the way his hands trembled as he held his axe. The work began in a grim silence. The men moved with a new kind of purpose, not one of ambition, but of desperation. They swung their axes with a furious energy, as if the sound of steel against wood could ward off the unseen terror that haunted them. Elias was in the thick of it, trying to set an example, but his mind kept replaying the image of Jed's contorted face. He had seen men die from accidents, from disease, but this was different. This was a slow, deliberate consumption of the mind and body. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew heavy, not with humidity, but with a strange metallic smell, like old blood and rust. One of the men, a wiry fellow named Silas, suddenly dropped his axe with a clatter. He stood motionless for a moment, his hands held out in front of him, as if pushing against an invisible wall. "It's in the air," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I can hear it. 1,000 tiny whispers. The other men froze, their axes poised. Elias walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Silas, you're tired. We all are. Let's take a break." But Silas didn't seem to hear him. He was staring at the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, his eyes wide and unblinking. "It's speaking to me," he said, a faint, haunted smile on his lips. "It wants to show me something." Silas then began to walk slowly towards the tree, his movements stiff and unnatural. The men watched in stunned silence as he reached out and pressed his hands against the rough bark. He closed his eyes and let out a soft groan of what could have been either pain or pleasure. Elias, sensing something was terribly wrong, ran to him and tried to pull him away. But Silas was rigid, his body as unmovable as the tree itself. His skin was turning an unnatural grey, and a faint, dark pattern, like the veins on a leaf, began to appear on the back of his hands. Just as suddenly as it had come over him, the trance broke. Silas recoiled from the tree, his face a mask of pure horror. "Get away!" he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Don't touch it. It's not a tree. It's a—" But before he could finish, he collapsed to the ground, his body seizing violently. The men stood frozen, watching the man they had known writhe in an agonizing fit. The dark veins on his hands spread quickly, racing up his arms and disappearing under his shirt. When the convulsions finally subsided, Silas was still, his eyes staring blankly into the canopy above. The dark veins had faded, but the pallor of his skin remained. He was gone. The death of Silas broke the fragile calm of the camp. Panic, a cold and cruel wind, swept through the men. "We have to leave," one man shouted, "now, before it gets us all." The men began to pack up their gear in a frantic rush, their movements clumsy with fear. Elias, however, stood his ground. "No," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't leave. Jed is still here. And what if this thing follows us? We need to understand it. We need to fight it." Samuel stood by his father's side, his hand on the hilt of his knife. "He's right," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "We don't know what's happening. Running blind is a fool's errand. We have to figure this out." Their words, while logical, did little to stem the tide of panic. The men were no longer a crew, but 15 individuals, each driven by a desperate primal need to survive. A small group of them, led by a burly man named Gus, decided to take their chances and leave immediately. "You're on your own, Thorn," Gus snarled, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "This ain't no fever. This is something else, and I'm not sticking around to find out what." He and his group of 3 other men packed their wagons and, without a word, began their treacherous journey back down the path. Elias, Samuel, and the remaining 9 men watched them go, a new and bitter kind of silence settling over the camp. The group was now smaller, the tension even greater. They were a fractured unit, bound not by loyalty, but by a shared, paralyzing fear. Elias looked at Jed, then at the spot where Silas had fallen. The metallic smell was still in the air. He walked over to the tree that Silas had touched. The bark was rough, but there was a faint, almost invisible, dark discoloration where the man had pressed his hands. It looked like a bruise on the ancient wood. That night, the thudding returned, but this time it was closer. It was a slow, measured beat, a sinister heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Elias and Samuel sat by the fire, their rifles across their laps. The other men were huddled in their tents, their fear a palpable presence in the air. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows, turning the surrounding trees into monstrous figures. The rhythmic thudding was maddening. It was a taunt, a countdown, and with each beat, Elias felt the knot of fear in his stomach tighten. He looked at Samuel and saw the same fear reflected in his son's eyes. They were alone in this. The others were too afraid, too consumed by their own terror. The 10 loggers who remained were facing an enemy they couldn't see, one that worked in the shadows and used their own minds against them. The forest was not just a place of wealth, it was a grave, and the trees were the tombstones. The morning after the thudding returned. A new layer of dread had settled over the camp. The 9 men who remained, besides Elias and Samuel, were a nervous, jittery lot. The easygoing nature of their expedition was a distant memory. The air was heavy with unspoken fear, and every rustle in the underbrush, every creak of a branch, made them flinch. Elias, now the undisputed leader of a broken crew, decided on a new course of action. They could not flee blindly, and they could not stay idle. They had to understand the cause of this silent contagion. He gathered the remaining men and pointed to the massive Douglas fir that Silas had touched. "We're going to fell that tree," he declared, his voice firm. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The tree seemed cursed, a living monument to their terror. But the idea of doing something, of taking back control, was more appealing than sitting and waiting for the next man to fall. With a new sense of grim purpose, they began their work. The sound of axes biting into the ancient wood was a jarring, defiant sound in the otherwise silent forest. As they worked, Samuel stayed close to his father, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods. He was no longer the naive boy who had set out on this journey. The past few days had aged him, replacing his youthful optimism with a hardened vigilance. He watched as the men worked, their movements tense and their focus narrow. The rhythmic chopping was a frantic pulse, a desperate attempt to drown out the oppressive silence and the sinister echoes of the previous night's thudding. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, but its light was filtered through the dense canopy, casting the forest in an eternal twilight. The strange metallic smell was still present, stronger now that they were so close to the tree. Finally, with a series of groans and cracks, the giant fir began to fall. The men scattered, watching with a mixture of awe and relief as the titanic trunk crashed to the forest floor with a sound that shook the very earth. A cloud of dust and pine needles erupted, and for a moment the world was silent again. When the dust settled, the men approached the fallen giant cautiously. There was something unnatural about the way it lay on the ground. The wood was a pale, sickly color, not the rich brown they were used to. And as they looked closer, they saw it. On the side of the trunk that had been pressed against the earth, there was a large, dark stain. It was the color of a deep bruise, an almost black patch that seemed to pulse with a faint internal light. Elias knelt down, a sense of dread rising in his throat. The bruise was in the shape of a massive, distorted handprint. He ran his hand over the wood, and a sudden sharp pain shot up his arm. He recoiled, his face contorted in a silent gasp. He looked at his hand. A faint, dark pattern like the one that had appeared on Silas's hands was now etched onto his own palm. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. The men saw it too. A collective gasp went through the group. "Don't touch the wood," one of them shouted. It's alive." Elias, his mind reeling, looked at his hand. The pattern was slowly fading, but the pain remained. A dull, throbbing ache that seemed to travel up his arm and into his very soul. He realized then that the sickness wasn't in the air. It was in the trees themselves. The Whispering Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, one that absorbed and consumed everything that dared to intrude. That night Elias couldn't sleep. The pain in his hand was a constant reminder of his folly. He was now tainted, just like Jed and Silas. He sat by the fire, watching his son sleep, a single thought echoing in his mind. I can't let this happen to him. The rhythmic thudding returned, closer than ever. It was coming from all around them, 1,000 small beats, as if 1,000 unseen things were slowly, methodically approaching. It was a sound of immense patience, of a slow and inevitable doom. In the morning, another man was gone. Elias woke to the frantic shouts of one of the men. A logger named Caleb, a man known for his quick wit and sharp tongue, had vanished. His tent was empty, his belongings untouched, and his tracks simply ended at the edge of the camp. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing. He had simply disappeared. Elias and Samuel spent hours searching the perimeter, their calls echoing through the oppressive silence of the forest. They found nothing. The disappearance of Caleb broke the remaining men. They were no longer a group. They were survivors, each for himself. Two of them, driven by a primal need to escape, grabbed their gear and, without a word, ran into the woods. They did not take the path. They just ran, straight into the dark embrace of the forest. Elias and Samuel watched them go, knowing they were running to their deaths. Now, there were only 7. The forest was winning. Elias looked at Samuel, his heart heavy with a fear he had never known. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice a low growl of defeat. "This place, it's not a forest. It's a hunting ground." They had to get out, and they had to figure out how to save Jed, who was still clinging to life in a state of feverish delirium. Elias knew the path back to town was long and treacherous, and the thing that was hunting them was growing bolder with each passing day, the thudding, the disappearances, the strange sickness. It was all part of a larger plan, a slow, methodical game of cat and mouse. They were the mice, the forest was the cat, and the game had just begun. The disappearance of Caleb and the mad flight of the 2 other men was a grim confirmation of their worst fears. The forest wasn't just a physical threat, it was a psychological one. It didn't need to attack them directly, it just needed to break their will. Elias Thorne, now with only a handful of men left, felt the weight of every lost soul on his shoulders. The initial ambition that had driven him here was now a distant, bitter memory. All that remained was a fierce, protective instinct for his son and a desperate need to escape this living nightmare. They spent the day in a state of high alert, their work a pretense for survival. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of panic through them. The air was filled with a constant, low humming sound, almost too faint to be heard, that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. It was a sound that Jed had described as 1,000 whispers. And now Elias understood. It wasn't a sound at all, it was a feeling, an unseen presence that was slowly, methodically encroaching on their minds. Elias and Samuel took turns watching Jed, who was still in a feverish stupor. His face was a pale imitation of itself, and the dark liquid that had seeped from his mouth was now a faint, dried crust. Elias had examined the wound on his own hand. The pain was gone, and the dark pattern had faded, but a new sensation had taken its place. It was a phantom itch, a tingling that ran from his palm up his arm as if something was moving beneath his skin. He didn't dare tell Samuel. His son had enough to worry about. That night the thudding was gone. In its place was a new sound, a series of faint rhythmic scratches against the trees just beyond the firelight. It was a chilling sound, a sound of deliberate, careful movements. One of the men, a quiet, older logger named George, stood up, his face a ghostly white. "It's marking them," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's marking the way." Elias grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you talking about, George?" he demanded. "The trees," George said, his voice trembling. "It's scratching a mark on them like a trail. It's not hunting us, it's herding us. It wants to funnel us somewhere. It wants us to go that way." He pointed a shaking finger towards the deepest part of the forest, the direction opposite to their camp. The sound of scratching stopped. The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of dread. The creature, or whatever it was a master strategist. It wasn't a monster of brute force, but of cunning and patience. The next morning they found more evidence of the forest's macabre game. As they walked around the perimeter of their camp, they discovered a series of faint, almost invisible scratch marks on the bark of the trees a few feet off the ground. They were long, thin lines, almost like fingernail scratches, and they formed a trail leading away from their camp and deeper into the unknown depths of the forest. The trail was a clear path, leading them away from civilization and towards something. A new wave of fear swept through the remaining men. They were not just trapped, they were being manipulated. The sickness, the disappearances, the sounds. It was all a careful, deliberate game. The forest wasn't a monster. It was a hunter, and it was playing with its prey. Elias looked at Samuel. His son's face was set, his jaw a hard line of defiance. He had seen the scratches too. The fear was there, but so was a cold, quiet anger. "We follow the trail," Samuel said, his voice surprising them all with its certainty. "What?" Elias said, his mind reeling. "Are you mad? That's what it wants us to do. It's a trap." "Maybe," Samuel said, his eyes meeting his father's. "But it's a known trap. The alternative is to wait for it to pick us off one by one, with no rhyme or reason. If we follow the trail, at least we'll know what we're up against. We'll be on its ground, but we'll be moving. We'll have a chance to fight back." Elias looked at the trail of scratches, then at the terrified faces of his remaining men. They had to choose. Stay and wait for the unseen hunter to claim them, or follow its twisted path and face whatever lay at the end. It was a choice between a slow, agonizing death and a chance, however slim, at survival. Elias, who had always been a man of action, made his decision. "We pack what we can," he said, his voice low and firm. "We take Jed, and we follow the trail. We face this thing head on." The men looked at each other, and a new resolve, born of desperation and the sheer terror of waiting, hardened their faces. They were no longer running. They were marching into the heart of the whispering hollow. They had no idea what awaited them, but they knew one thing for certain. The hunter was no longer unseen. It had shown them its path, and now they would follow it, a grim procession of men walking into the jaws of a silent and terrible beast. The trail of scratches led them deeper into the forest, a grim, silent procession of 7 men carrying their unconscious friend. The path was not a natural one. It wound through thickets and over fallen logs with an unnatural precision, as if an unseen hand had cleared the way for them. The trees grew closer and more gnarled, their branches twisting into grotesque skeletal shapes. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the scuffling of their boots on the mossy ground and the labored breathing of the men. The strange, metallic smell was now a constant, almost overwhelming presence. They traveled for hours, the sun now a faint, sickly light that barely penetrated the canopy. Elias felt the phantom itch on his hand, a constant nagging reminder of his mistake. He looked at Samuel, who was walking beside him, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The boy's face was a mask of grim determination. He was no longer a boy. He was a man, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation. Just as they were about to give up hope of finding anything, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a single, ancient pine tree, its branches reaching out like gnarled arms. The air in the clearing was different. It was colder, and the metallic smell was gone, replaced by the faint, sweet scent of decaying leaves. But it was what lay at the base of the tree that made them all stop dead in their tracks. There, propped against the trunk, was a figure, an old man, dressed in a mix of buckskin and what looked like woven tree bark. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and his long white hair was braided with thin strips of leather. He was a Native American, and he was staring at them with eyes that held 1,000 years of wisdom and sorrow. A small, crude carving of a hand, made of what looked like hardened clay, lay on the ground beside him. Elias, his hand on his rifle, approached cautiously. "We mean you no harm, old one," he said, his voice low and respectful. "We are lost." The old man didn't respond. He simply pointed a gnarled finger at the unconscious form of Jedediah Miller. "The sickness of the hollow," he said, his voice a dry rasp, barely above a whisper. "It has claimed another." His words were not a question, but a statement of fact. Elias, dumbfounded, looked from the man to Jed. "How do you know?" "I have seen this before," the old man said, his eyes never leaving Jed. "Many times. The forest, it is not a thing of wood and earth. It is a living memory. It remembers every tree that was felled, every life that was taken from it, and it seeks to reclaim what was lost." The men exchanged nervous glances. The old man's words, so calm and matter-of-fact, were a confirmation of their worst fears. This was not a random sickness. It was a conscious act. "What is it?" Samuel asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "What is it doing to them?" "It gives them a part of itself," the old man said, looking at Elias's hand, his eyes seeming to see the faint invisible pattern. "The mark of the forest. It gives them a new life, a new way of being. It makes them one with the hollow. But a hollow can't live on its own. It needs a body, a host." He then told them a chilling tale. For generations his people, the rogue, had lived in harmony with the forest. They understood its moods, its cycles, its ancient power. They called it the Green Guardian. But then, the white man came. They didn't see the forest as a living being. They saw it as a commodity, as something to be conquered and exploited. And as they felled the trees, the Green Guardian began to retaliate. It didn't attack with brute force. It attacked with subtlety, with a silent, consuming power. It would infect the loggers, slowly turning them into part of the forest itself. It would absorb them, their bodies becoming a new kind of wood, their souls a part of the forest's ancient, bitter consciousness. The thudding they heard was the sound of the forest's heart, a slow, patient beat as it waited for its prey to be consumed. "There are others," the old man said, his voice now a low growl. "Lost in the hollow. They are the ones who do the bidding of the forest. They are the ones who make the scratches, who call to the new hosts. They are the old ones, the ones who were consumed." The men were horrified. The two men who had run off, Caleb. They weren't dead. They were something else, something worse. They were now a part of the forest, its silent, unseen hunters. "How do we stop it?" Elias asked, his voice a desperate plea. The old man shook his head. "You don't. You can't. The forest is too old, too powerful. You can only survive, and you must do it alone. The forest cannot take a man who has no connection to it. Only the ones who carry the mark can be taken." He looked at Elias's hand again. "You have been marked. He said, pointing at Samuel, "has not. You are the host. He is the witness. The forest wants you, not him. You must cut your connection to it." Elias looked at his hand, then at his son. The old man's words hung in the air, a terrible, final pronouncement. The only way to save Samuel, to save his remaining men, was to sacrifice himself, to sever his connection to the forest by what? He didn't know. The old man, seeing the despair in his eyes, simply pointed to the carving of the hand on the ground. "When you know what you must do," he said, "the answer will be there. Find the place where the earth bleeds, the heart of the forest, and sever the connection. If you don't, you will become like the others. You will become a part of the forest's revenge." With that, the old man rose, and without another word turned and walked back into the woods, his form quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence. They were left alone, 7 men and a dying one, with a terrible truth and a choice. They had to find the place where the earth bleeds, and Elias had to make a sacrifice. They had entered the forest seeking fortune. They were now fighting to escape its clutches, to save their souls from becoming a permanent part of its chilling revenge. The stakes had never been higher. The old man's words were a cold, hard dose of reality. The forest wasn't just a place of trees and animals. It was a sentient, vengeful entity, and they were its latest victims. Elias Thorne, his hand still faintly tingling with the phantom itch, knew he had a choice to make. The old man had given him a path, however treacherous. Find the heart of the forest, the place where the earth bleeds, and sever the connection. The men, their fear now replaced by a grim resolve, looked to him for guidance. They were no longer running. They were on a mission, a suicidal, desperate one, but a mission nonetheless. They packed up their camp and began their new journey, following the old man's vague directions. They had to go deeper into a part of the forest that seemed to have been untouched by time itself. The trees here were impossibly tall, their ancient trunks covered in a thick layer of moss and strange, fibrous fungi. The air was heavy and still, the light a faint, almost non-existent presence. They moved like ghosts through a graveyard, their every step a deliberate act of courage. As they walked, the ground beneath their feet grew softer, more spongy. The scent of pine and moss was replaced by a cloying, sweet smell, like rotten fruit and damp earth. They had been walking for hours when Samuel, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped. "Look," he whispered, pointing ahead. The ground was a dark, rich brown, almost black, and it was weeping. A thick, dark liquid, the color of dried blood, was seeping from the earth itself, forming small, glistening pools. The liquid was thick and viscous, and it had a strange, metallic smell, the same smell they had noticed at the camp. This was it, the place where the earth bled, the heart of the forest. In the center of the weeping earth stood a cluster of trees, ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting into a bizarre, interconnected knot. The sound was back, not the thudding, but the thousand whispers. Now a low, mournful hum that seemed to be coming from the trees themselves. Elias felt the phantom itch on his hand intensify, a sharp, stabbing pain that made him wince. The forest was here. It was waiting. He knew what he had to do. The old man had said he had to sever his connection. He looked at the carving the old man had left behind, the crude hand made of clay. He thought about the men who had been consumed, the men who were now a part of this monstrous consciousness. He had to stop it. For them. For Samuel. He walked to the center of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The men watched in terrified silence. He knelt down and plunged his hands into the dark, weeping earth. The liquid was cold and thick, and as soon as he touched it, a shock of pure pain ripped through his body. He gasped, his back arching, his face contorting in a silent scream. He felt the forest's consciousness flood his mind, a torrent of ancient memories and bitter resentment. He saw the centuries of trees felled, the lives taken, the land scarred and violated. He saw the faces of the men who had been consumed, their eyes filled with a serene, terrifying emptiness. And then he saw Silas and Caleb and the others, their bodies now a part of the twisted, gnarled trunks of the trees. They were there, just beyond the veil, a part of the same consciousness, waiting for him. He felt the forest's consciousness try to consume him, to pull him in, to make him one of its silent, empty vessels. But a new thought entered his mind, a defiant, searing thought. He wouldn't be a part of its vengeance. He would be the one who stopped it. He was a man, not a tree. He was a father, a leader. He had a son to protect. He screamed, a long, guttural cry that echoed through the silent forest. He pulled his hands out of the earth, and with a final, desperate act, he smashed the clay hand on the ground. The clay shattered, and with it, the pain in his hand vanished. The phantom itch was gone. The forest's consciousness receded, leaving him alone, panting and shaking, on the ground. The weeping earth slowly began to recede, the dark, viscous liquid sinking back into the ground. The low hum of the thousand whispers died down, replaced by a new kind of silence, a silence that felt empty. The pressure was gone. The unseen hunter had been defeated. Elias had severed the connection, but the ordeal was not over. The forest was wounded, but not defeated. And as they walked back to their camp, now a new, exhausted group of men, they came across a sight that made their blood run cold. Lying on the path, a few feet from their old camp, were 4 men. They were the ones who had run off in a panic. But they were not dead. They were still, their eyes staring blankly at the canopy above, and on the back of each of their necks, a single dark, swirling mark. The same mark that had appeared on the back of Jed's neck. The mark that was a twisted, corrupted version of a handprint. The forest hadn't been defeated. It had simply found a new way to mark its victims. Elias had severed his connection, but he had failed to save the men who had been consumed. They were still out there, a part of the forest's grim, silent army, and the nightmare had just begun. The sight of the 4 men, their bodies still and their eyes vacant, was a terrifying new twist in their living nightmare. They were not dead, but they were something far worse. The mark on the back of their necks, a grotesque echo of a handprint, was a sign that the forest had taken them, consumed them from the inside out. They were hosts, empty vessels, their wills now a part of the forest's twisted consciousness. The group stood in stunned silence. Their brief moment of triumph turned to a new, cold dread. Elias, his mind reeling from the psychic assault he had just endured, felt a new kind of fear. He had severed his connection. But what if the forest hadn't targeted him alone? What if it had marked them all, in some subtle, invisible way? He looked at the remaining men, at Samuel, and saw the same question in their eyes. They were no longer sure who was a friend and who was an empty shell waiting to be activated. The remaining loggers, a group of 7 tired, paranoid men, were now a fractured unit. The trust was gone. Every quiet moment was filled with suspicion. They watched each other, their eyes darting to the back of their companions' necks, searching for a sign, for the macabre mark. Elias knew they couldn't stay. They had to get out, and they had to take Jed with them. He was still unconscious, still clinging to life, a fragile testament to the forest's slow, deliberate malice. The journey back was a waking nightmare. The men walked in a tight formation, their backs to each other, their rifles at the ready. They had to pass through the very parts of the forest they had marked and felled, a grim reminder of their initial transgression. The low, mournful hum of the 1,000 whispers was gone, but in its place was a new sound. The faint, dry rustle of leaves, as if 1,000 unseen things were moving just beyond their sight, a constant, chilling presence that was watching them, waiting for a moment of weakness. They had been walking for a full day when the new attack came. It wasn't a physical one. It was a sound, a man's voice calling out from the shadows, "Elias, help me, I'm lost." The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it was familiar. It was Caleb's voice. One of the men, a kind-hearted logger named Ben, stopped, his face contorted in a mixture of fear and concern. "Caleb," he called out, "is that you? We're here." "Don't!" Elias yelled, but it was too late. Ben had broken rank. He began to walk towards the sound, his face filled with a desperate hope. "It's a trick, Ben, don't go," Elias pleaded, his voice hoarse. But Ben was no longer listening. The voice was calling to him, a siren song promising salvation. He walked into the deep shadows of the forest, and just as he was about to disappear, they saw it. A hand, gnarled and covered in moss, reached out from the darkness and grabbed him by the arm. A brief, muffled scream, and then silence. The remaining men stood frozen, their faces a mask of pure terror. They had just witnessed a man they knew, a friend, be consumed by the forest. It was no longer an unseen hunter. It was a visible one, its minions now a part of its chilling, silent army. Elias, with a new sense of cold dread, realized what the old man had meant. The men who had been consumed were not just empty vessels. They were the forest's weapons. They were its hands, its eyes, its voice. They had to keep moving. They had to get out. With a new, feverish urgency, they started their trek again, their movements now a frantic, clumsy run. They were no longer walking. They were fleeing. Every shadow was a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves a sign that one of the old ones was near. The final and most terrifying assault came at nightfall. They had found a small, rocky outcropping to make camp, a place with no trees to hide the unseen enemy. They built a large fire, its flames a defiant, flickering light against the oppressive darkness. They huddled together, their rifles at the ready, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. Then, they heard it. A quiet, rhythmic, scraping sound coming from just beyond the light. Elias, his heart pounding in his chest, looked up. On a large, flat rock, a few feet from their camp, were 2 figures. They were the 2 men who had run off in a panic. They were standing motionless, their backs to the fire, their bodies rigid. They didn't seem to notice the light or the men. They were just there. And in the dim light of the fire, Elias could see it. On the back of their necks, a faint, dark swirl. The same macabre mark. He knew what they were. They were the old ones, the lost loggers. They were the hands of the forest. And as Elias watched, one of them, a man named Mark, slowly raised his hands to his face. He began to scratch at his skin, his movements slow and methodical, his expressionless face a mask of serene, terrifying emptiness. He scratched and scratched, tearing away at his own flesh, the sound a sickening, soft rasping in the silent night. The men watched, horrified, as Mark tore off his own flesh, his face now a raw, bleeding mess, and in the dim light of the fire, they saw it. Beneath the skin, a network of dark, wiry veins like the roots of a tree, pulsating with a faint internal light. The man was not human. He was a vessel, a living, breathing part of the forest. The men stood frozen, their rifles useless against this silent, chilling horror. They had entered the forest as conquerors, as men of steel and ambition. They were now just prey. The forest had taken their friends, turned them into its silent, macabre army, and now it was putting on a show, a grotesque display of its power. Elias had severed his connection, but the forest's grip on them was stronger than ever. It had a new weapon, their own kind, turned against them. If you've made it this far, the terror is only just beginning. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. The grotesque spectacle of their former comrade, Mark, mutilating himself, was a sight that seared itself into the minds of the remaining loggers. The men were not just terrified, they were broken. The silent, empty and bleeding figure of Mark, standing motionless just beyond the firelight, was a grim, final confirmation of their living nightmare. The forest wasn't just killing them, it was desecrating them, turning them into its living, breathing instruments of horror. Elias Thorne, his rifle now a useless piece of wood in his hands, felt a cold, paralyzing fear. He had faced down grizzlies, survived blizzards, and endured the unforgiving wilderness. But this was a new kind of terror. This was a battle against something that used their own flesh and blood against them. He had a choice to make. They could stay and wait for the old ones to pick them off one by one, or they could try to make a run for it, risking an open battle with their former friends. He chose to run. He looked at his son Samuel, his face pale and drawn, and in his eyes, Elias saw the same grim resolve. They had to get out, and they had to take Jed with them. The journey back was a frantic, desperate flight. They abandoned their wagons, their gear, everything. They were no longer loggers. They were fugitives. They moved through the darkness, their every step a deliberate act of quiet desperation. The silent, empty figures of the old ones were never far behind. They were always there, just beyond the edge of their vision, their movements a faint, dry rustle of leaves. As they ran, Elias noticed something else. The old ones were not just following them, they were watching them, studying them. Their vacant eyes seemed to be calculating their every move, their every weakness. It was a chilling realization. This wasn't a mindless pursuit. It was a slow, methodical hunt. The forest was learning them, adapting to their fears, and it was using its new eyes and hands to do so. They had been running for hours when they reached a small, rocky ravine. It was a natural bottleneck, a perfect place for an ambush. Elias, his heart pounding in his chest, knew it was a trap, but there was no other way. They had to cross. He sent one of the men ahead to scout. A few minutes later the man returned, his face a ghostly white. "They're there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "4 of them, lying on the ground. They're waiting for us." Elias knew they couldn't fight them. They had no idea what they were up against. But they couldn't turn back. He looked at Samuel, and in his eyes, Elias saw a flash of an idea. "The fire," Samuel said, his voice a low growl of determination. "The old man said the forest is a memory. It wants to reclaim what was lost. Maybe we can give it something new, something it can't comprehend." Elias, his mind reeling, understood. They were no longer fighting the forest's vengeance. They were fighting its nature. The forest was an organic entity, a being of wood and earth and life. They had to introduce something inorganic, something that would confuse and disrupt its consciousness. They began to gather dry tinder, leaves, and branches. With a grim, feverish energy, they began to prepare. They were no longer fleeing. They were fighting back, not with axes and rifles, but with fire. They were going to burn the old ones. They were going to cleanse the forest of its macabre army. As they worked, the silent figures of the old ones began to move. They rose from their positions, their movements slow and deliberate, and began to walk towards them, their vacant eyes fixed on the flickering light of the small fire. They were not running, they were marching, a silent, unstoppable army of empty vessels. Elias lit the first torch, its flame a small, defiant light in the suffocating darkness. "We can't hesitate," he said, his voice low and firm. "We have to be fast. We have to be merciless." He looked at the faces of his remaining men and saw not just fear, but a new kind of resolve, born of desperation and the sheer will to survive. They were going to fight back. They were going to burn the forest's army. But they were too late. Just as they were about to throw the torches, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared from the shadows, a man. He was tall and gaunt, his face a mask of raw, bleeding flesh. It was Mark. He was no longer a silent puppet. He was speaking. His voice was a strange, garbled sound, a mix of a man's voice and a low, mournful hum. "We want to go home," he said, his eyes filled with a terrifying, serene emptiness. "We want to be free." The men froze, their torches poised. Mark was not just an empty vessel, he was something else. He was a man and a puppet. He was a host, and he was fighting back. He was a new kind of wound, a human consciousness struggling against the ancient, bitter will of the forest. And with that revelation, the terror took on a new, more profound layer. They were not fighting a monster. They were fighting their friends, who were trapped inside a living nightmare, begging for salvation. The garbled, pleading voice of Mark, a chilling fusion of human consciousness and the forest's ancient will, froze the remaining loggers in their tracks. It wasn't just a physical battle anymore. It was a psychological one. They weren't fighting a monster. They were fighting for the souls of their friends. The old ones weren't mindless puppets. They were hostages, their consciousness trapped inside a monstrous living prison. Elias Thorne, his hand clutching the torch, felt a new kind of horror. He'd been prepared to burn his friends to save himself, but he couldn't. Not now. The other old ones had gathered around Mark, their bodies still and their faces vacant. They seemed to be waiting, their presence a silent, suffocating weight. The air was filled with a new sound, a cacophony of soft whispers, faint, disjointed phrases, and low moans. It was the collective consciousness of the men who had been consumed, their souls trapped in a terrible, eternal purgatory. The forest wasn't just a hunter, it was a jailer. Elias looked at Samuel, and in his eyes he saw the same dawning realization. They couldn't use fire. They had to save them. But how? They were 7 men against an entire forest, an ancient, vengeful entity that had turned their friends into its weapons. "The hand," Samuel whispered, his voice shaking. "The old man," he said, to cut the connection, to sever it. Elias understood. He had severed his connection to the forest by destroying the clay hand. But the old ones were the forest's hands. They were the physical manifestation of its will. The only way to save them was to destroy the source of their power, to sever their connection to the forest. But what was that source? It wasn't the trees. It was something else, something inside them. Elias looked at the back of Jed's neck, at the faint swirling mark, the mark of the forest, the macabre handprint. That was the source. That was the point of connection. He had to cut it. He had to sever the connection with a new kind of sacrifice. He had to destroy the mark. But to do that, he would have to get close to them. He would have to face the old ones, the silent, empty husks of his friends, and destroy the mark that bound them to the forest. It was a suicidal, desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. He looked at his son, his heart heavy with a terrible premonition. He couldn't ask Samuel to do this. He was a father and a leader. This was his burden. "I'll do it," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'll get close to them. I'll use my hunting knife. You have to run. You have to get Jed out of here, and you have to keep running until you're out of this place." The men, their faces a mixture of fear and admiration, nodded. They understood. This was Elias's final sacrifice. He was going to face the forest's army alone, and he was going to save them, even if it cost him his life. Samuel refused. "No, father. We'll do it together." Elias shook his head. "I have to do this alone, son. The forest is after me. It wants me. If you're with me, it will get you too." He looked at his son one last time, a silent goodbye passing between them. He turned and began to walk towards the ravine, towards the silent, waiting figures of the old ones. His hand, which had once ached with the pain of the forest's mark, now felt a new kind of pain, a deep, soul-crushing sadness. He was walking to his death, but he was walking to save the people he cared about. He got close to them. They didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes vacant, their bodies still. Elias reached for his hunting knife, his hand shaking. He had to do this. He had to sever the connection. He had to free their souls. He approached Mark, the man whose voice had pleaded for salvation. He raised the knife, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he was about to strike, something unexpected happened. A low, mournful hum filled the air. The old ones suddenly turned their heads, not to Elias, but to the forest. And a new sound filled the air, the rhythmic, low thudding, the one they had heard on the first night. It was back. It was coming from all around them, 1,000 maddening beats. The old ones began to move, but not towards Elias. They began to walk towards the source of the sound, their movements still, but with a new, feverish urgency. They were no longer the silent army of the forest. They were something else. They were being pulled like puppets on a string towards a new destination. The forest had not been defeated. It had a new plan. And as Elias watched, horrified, the old ones walked into the shadows, disappearing from his sight, their silent, empty forms swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the forest. He stood there alone, his knife still in his hand, a sense of profound failure and confusion washing over him. The forest hadn't been defeated. It had just changed its game. It had a new target, a new purpose, and he had no idea what it was. The final terrible realization dawned on him. They were not fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their souls, and they were losing. Elias Thorne stood alone in the ravine, his hunting knife still in his hand, the sound of the rhythmic thudding echoing in his ears. The old ones had vanished, swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the forest. The silence that followed was a heavy, suffocating weight, a silence that felt final and absolute. The forest wasn't just a hunter. It was a sentient, patient strategist, a master of psychological warfare. It had broken them, manipulated them, and now it had a new, terrifying purpose. The remaining loggers, now just a handful of men, waited for Elias. Samuel was the first to approach, his face a mask of concern. "Father, what happened?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "It changed," Elias said, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "It didn't want us to fight. It wanted us to run. It wanted us to believe we were winning. It wanted us to hope. And now, it has a new target, a new plan. They had to get out. They had to leave this place behind. They had to get Jed to safety, to a place where he could get help." They walked in a grim, silent procession, their movements now a frantic, clumsy run. They were no longer walking. They were fleeing, their eyes constantly darting into the shadows, expecting the unseen to appear at any moment. The thudding, the same maddening rhythm that had plagued them on the first night, followed them, a constant, sinister heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. They ran for hours, their bodies screaming in protest, their minds on the brink of collapse. Finally they saw it. A thin, faint trail of light in the distance. They were nearing the edge of the forest, the boundary between the Whispering Hollow and the world of man. They were almost home. As they reached the edge of the forest, the thudding stopped. The silence that followed was a blessing, but also a chilling new kind of dread. They had escaped the forest, but had the forest escaped them? Elias looked at his hand, the faint, phantom itch now a new, permanent part of his life. He was a survivor, but he was also a changed man. The forest had left its mark on him, not just on his hand, but on his soul. They brought Jed to a doctor. The doctor, a kind older man, examined him, but he couldn't explain the fever, the dark stain around his lips, or the strange, swirling mark on the back of his neck. Jed remained in a feverish coma, his mind trapped in a silent, terrifying world. The doctor had no explanation for his condition. He simply called it a wilderness fever, a sickness brought on by exposure to the elements. But Elias knew the truth. Jed wasn't sick, he was a hostage. His mind was still trapped in the Whispering Hollow, his soul a part of the forest's eternal bitter consciousness. Of the 15 men who had entered the forest, only 4 walked out. Elias Thorne, his son Samuel, and 2 other loggers. The other 11 men were gone. They were either dead, or worse, they were a part of the forest's army. Elias told the authorities about what had happened, but they dismissed his story as a fevered hallucination, a product of a man driven mad by the harsh realities of the wilderness. The 4 survivors were left to carry their burden alone. Years passed. The story of the lost loggers became a local legend, a chilling tale told around campfires. Elias and Samuel never returned to the Whispering Hollow. They became a different kind of logger, a quiet, haunted kind, their lives a constant, silent battle against the memories of the forest. One day, years later, Elias was reading a newspaper. An article caught his eye. A new logging company had entered the Whispering Hollow. They were a large, ambitious operation, and they were going to harvest the legendary stand of old-growth timber. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. He knew what awaited them. He knew the forest was not defeated. It was waiting. He looked at his hand. The faint, faded scar of the phantom itch, a constant, chilling reminder. He knew the story was not over. The forest had not just taken the men, it had taken their legacy. It had left a mark on them, a permanent scar that would forever bind them to the Whispering Hollow. The final, terrifying realization dawned on him. The forest wasn't just a living, vengeful entity. It was a memory. And now, the memory was spreading. The new loggers, the new victims, were walking into a nightmare that was not their own. They were walking into the legacy of the Hollow, a legacy of terror, of a silent, consuming evil that had taken a group of men and turned them into a part of its chilling, eternal revenge. The legend of the lost loggers was not a story of the past. It was a story of the future, and it was waiting for its next chapter.